Hey everybody, this week we're talking about a global history of the UFO phenomenon and mashed potatoes. I'm Jason Herbert, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. I had seen the book coming out, I think at the AHA. I was talking to the folks at the press, and I am absolutely a sucker for good book covers. Just, they say don't judge a book by the cover, and yeah. I am like, no, absolutely, I'm 1,000%. So I saw this. I've got, like, they sent me a copy over here, right? And this thing is like, it's a gorgeous book. Like, and then I read it, and I was like, I love this book. So I got so excited about this. I reached out to you. I was like, hi, I've never met you before. You want to come on my podcast and talk about the work? And I'm just so excited to be here, that you're joining in, especially from across, I guess, halfway across the earth. You're in Berlin right now, you were just saying, right?
Exactly. I'm in Berlin, Germany right now. So
all right. So I have to ask you, did you see anything strange on the flight over to Berlin?
No. Absolutely not, but I had my eyes closed most of the time. And then, they pull the shades down. So I did not see anything that way. But I'm glad you like that book cover. The production people put a lot of effort. That was the third or fourth version. So there were other versions we went through. And I still remember a few, I can't remember when that was, maybe a couple summers ago when they gave some to me. And I sat here with my wife and a friend of mine, and we put up on the wall because we had a projector. Mm-hmm. We were like, okay, which one do we like the best? And this one won hands down.
It's a gorgeous book. I mean, and the words apparently. So apparently, if you're just coming to the podcast, not only do we look at books, sometimes we actually look inside of them. And there's this amazing there's the black representations on the page called ink, and inside the ink, you put together those words, and the words are very. I mean, I was like. Sometimes I get these things and I just kind of cursory pass through them, so forth and things like that. And I started to do that with your book. And then I just kept getting drawn in by it because, I grew up in science fiction. You and I were talking about what film to do. And I threw some ideas at you about books and about movies. And you were like, Close Encounters. And I was like, does this ever line up really perfectly with the stuff that's in, the stuff that's inside the book. So I have so many questions for you about this. First and foremost, though, you want to introduce yourself to the crew here at HATM and tell us like who you are and like what you're doing?
Yeah, I am a historian of science and medicine. I've done a lot of work in areas I guess you would say are not terribly connected to UFOs and aliens and things like that. I've written a lot about stuff involving the history of madness, the history of medicine, things like that. But I'm interested in a lot of things, and this is one topic I became kind of interested in. And so I started to dip a toe in these waters probably a good 10 years ago. And as I started to sort of dig around some more and do the things that kind of us nerdy historians do, where I'm like, this is kind of weird. I'd like to know a little more, and I want to find out who else has written about it. And then when I found out that really professional historians, like academic historians, haven't been writing books, I just figured they were like, 30 books on this topic. Mm-hmm. And the only one I could find was written in 1975. So I thought, man, that's kind of weird. So that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to take this on. And I was in for a surprise. Surprise.
I have so many questions for you about the Creationist book, which I want to get into on this, especially because this is not your first book. You were talking about how this is kind of a departure from your previous from some of your previous work. And I guess you're in Germany. You're doing research now. Are you kind of going back to your previous? Like, are you going away from UFOs now with your current work? Like, is this a one-off stint?
No, this is not. What I'm doing now is I'm actually this summer I'm just finishing another book which is basically a long history of madness from the ancient world to the present, finishing that up. And once I get that done, then I'm going back to something I just started to begin after I finish the UFO book, which is going to be a specific history of the controversy surrounding alien abductions, mostly concentrating on the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So I'm coming back to this.
Okay, good.
Once it's in you, you can't leave it.
No, I'm penciling you in for Fire in the Sky.
Okay,
like
it's
right
a
now.
deal.
Have you ever seen that film?
Yeah.
It terrified me the first time we saw it.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely scared the snot out of me. I think it's available right now on Prime. It's a scary film. Just the whole, I don't know. We can get into I guess maybe we can talk a little bit about maybe the differences between the narratives that we've seen between sightings and abductions here. Here a little bit. I'm guessing the narratives might be just a little bit different from what you've seen and so forth. So the first question I've got for you, we can't. I reached out to you. I was like, hey, what movie should we do? I was like, Mars Attacks, Independence Day, and you said Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I was like, absolutely, let's go. But Greg, why Close Encounters? Why was this the film that you were like, hey, let's talk about this particular movie?
Well, so I think for me, it's two or three things. For one thing, I know that Spielberg did research for this. He was talking with people who were investigating UFOs at the time. So he really made a point of trying to get all sorts of stuff in that really is there, like really was out there at the time. And you can see it in the film. The lights, the kind of objects that are seen in the shapes, you get these really cool little things he does, like Roy cutting out news clippings and magazine clippings and things like that. All of these little things. I thought that was kind of cool. Another thing I really, really like is the kind of, if you will, the kind of cast of characters. I don't mean individual characters. I mean, we've got really these sort of four groups. We got scientists, we got the military, we got kind of a religious theme, and then we got these ordinary folks. And all of that really is something that really was always at the heart of the UFO phenomenon, but particularly in the 70s. I kind of love that he gets all these four elements in there and, makes it all work somehow. And then I guess the last thing was the year this comes out. It comes out in 1977. And 77 is a really good year in many ways to kind of, just do a real sort of checkup on where things stood in the kind of broad history of this thing going on, because it's the middle 70s are really a transition between a world of the 50s and 60s in which the focus was on sightings. When people talked about aliens, they were kind of really nice and friendly aliens who looked like us. You get into the 80s and 90s, then all of a sudden you hear a lot more conspiracy theories. Things get really dark, alien abduction, things like this. The movie's got a foot kind of in both of those camps, and I thought that was pretty cool. And so one of the things looking at the film again, I keep seeing the kind of ways in which Spielberg, I don't think he was even aware of it, seems to be kind of navigating this really new sort of world of UFOs that is just starting to take shape at this time. So it's pretty cool. There's a lot going on.
This film comes out in 70. I was thinking when you said this film, I was like, oh yeah, it came out in 81. No, this is 77. This is Star Wars year. And in fact, there was a bet between Spielberg and Lucas. Lucas thought that this film would far outperform Star Wars. And Spielberg's like, absolutely not. And apparently, I don't know if you know, like they decided to trade each other profits on the films. Spielberg came out ahead on that one, but I think George Lucas is going to be just fine after everything is all said and done with what happened with Star Wars. So I'm kind of wondering, as far as like, where does this fascination on the people, like with the idea of UFOs, come from? Is this a cultural thing? As I came into your book, I was wondering, it's like, wait a second, when's the first UFO sighting? Is this a relatively new phenomenon? One of the things I liked about your book is like, you're not actually trying to weigh in on whether or not you think UFOs exist, but actually just take this as a real thing. Like, people are really serious about whether or not they believe in these sightings and things like that. So I'm kind of wondering, from a historical standpoint, like, what are you seeing in the archives as far as the first UFO sighting? When does this occur?
Yeah, that's one of the first things you got to figure out when you sort of throw yourself into this is where do you begin with all of these things? But in history you have to do that all the time anyway. But I don't know. I mean, so for me, it seemed to me essential to sit there and say, what I'm interested in is this thing that most of us think about and conjure up in our minds when we think about UFOs, and that's the flying saucer. And when does that kind of thing emerge? And there are going to be people who've made arguments that there were sightings of things similar earlier than the 20th century. But I think it's pretty clear that whatever it is, the whole fascination, the obsession, and all that stuff, that all begins in the summer of 1947, when this private pilot by the name of Kenneth Arnold's flying around Mount Rainier, sees these 9 fast-moving objects that don't really have a fuselage. They just seem to be like bat wings, really moving fast, making maneuvers that didn't make sense to him. And he sort of reports them to the media, reports them eventually to the military. And he thought they were probably, secret military aircraft or technologies. That's what he thought it was. But in any event, they become known because of some enterprising journalist out there. They become known as flying saucers when he asks Arnold, hey, how would you describe the way these things move? And he said, well, they'd move sort of if you skipped a saucer over water. And that's when this guy comes up with flying saucers. So that's really kind of the first time you see it emerge. And so from that moment on, this thing kind of takes shape and crystallizes as this great mystery. And I mean, you're asking about, like, why does this thing blow up like it does? How do we explain that? And I think the first thing is it's a mystery. Now, mysteries have always existed, so that's nothing new. But one of the key things about this mystery is you don't even know if it's a mystery. It's a double order mystery, because ultimately, right, the skeptic is going to sit there and say, this isn't a mystery. This is just really mundane stuff. But there are these other elements to it, I think, as well. And that is, there's a couple of anthropologists put it this way that I thought was really cool. They said, the thing about UFOs is what they are is they're a thing and a theory at the same time, right? It's when you talk about a UFO, if you say to friends, I saw a UFO, everybody's thinking Jason didn't just see something strange he can't identify. It's like, oh, Jason saw some sort of interplanetary aliens, spacecraft, right? So it carries all this stuff with it. And so I think that's a big part. And then the other part of it that made it really, I think, different than you say earlier apparitions in history is the technology and science element, right? Because it's all about the fact that this advanced, if these are aliens, or let's even say it's Soviet technology or something, it means really advanced people and smart beings are making some really incredible things. That means they're really, really sophisticated technically and scientifically. And so it raises all sorts of questions. Are science and technology going to destroy us, or are they the things that are going to save us? And that becomes a really big part of the whole story as people sort of weigh in on this issue. And you get a lot of that, of course, in the movie, right?
I was going to talk about this later on, but you talk about this in the book, and let's go ahead and talk about this now. The idea of UFO sightings as part of, say, the Cold War, coming out of World War II and things like that. You talk about the sightings and stuff like that. The United States is in this arms race and space race with the Soviet Union. Are UFOs just scaring the crap out of people too? This idea that, wait a second, all of a sudden we're not at the top of the heap when it comes to science, technology, things like that. There are other more advanced peoples out there possibly than us. Like, how is the Cold War shaping these UFO sightings and vice versa?
Yeah, the Cold War plays a really, really critical role. I'd argue it's an essential role in all this, partly because of all the trappings of the Cold War, right? Secret government programs,
Hmm.
spying, counterintelligence, sophisticated technologies, particularly in aeronautics that had never been seen, hardly could even be imagined before. And of course, the Cold War slash, you have to even say the end of World War II, gives us atomic weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles and all of that. All of those things come to play a really big role in all of this stuff. And so fear is one of the things that's there. And people have made this argument, right? The UFO phenomenon is really about anxiety about the Cold War and about our future and whether we're all going to be blown up. But the other part of it that people miss and that is in the material is in fact another side, which is a lot of people come to it with enthusiasm and excitement. And that's what you get in the movie, right? Is
Oh
people
yeah.
who see in it this glorious opportunity to save ourselves from it all. And the idea that a lot of people are going to make this argument already in the early 50s is the aliens are here and they're not here to take us over. They're here to save us from ourselves. And you get people in the early 50s called the contactees who say, I've talked with these beings and they tell me they're here because they see what we're doing to ourselves. And they've seen what kind of weapons we're creating. And they're here to instruct us because they're super wise people and beings. They're here to help us find a new path into a new order and a new age.
Yeah, this feels a bit like Earth, the day the Earth still stood stillish, right? That's the idea is like these galactic people, and the idea that like they would only be able to reach this advanced level of technology if they had managed to not blow each other up somewhere along the way, and therefore like coming down like Big Brother, like okay, you guys have to stop fighting. There's some sense of this, and of course it's reflected different ways in film and things like that. There's always, we were talking before we got in, the idea of Fire in the Sky, where it's like the little gray men are terrifying.
Yeah.
The little gray men in this film are quite lovely. We'll talk about them a little bit. And of course, there's a little gray man ET who's out there coming to us from Spielberg in just a few more years that we can also talk about. I wonder. This is a global history, though, Greg. So this is not limited to the United States. We talk about this coming around, say, the first one in 47 around Rainier. But how does this spread? How do these sightings begin to spread, say, after 47? This isn't just limited to the Pacific Northwest or the United States writ large. It is a global thing, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, it happens pretty quickly. The first thing that happens is after Kenneth Arnold has sightings, there's an explosion of a wave, as it's called, of sightings throughout the United States over the summer of 1947. And this stuff gets covered by newspapers across the world. And the way it gets covered is actually through international news agencies like the Associated Press, right? And places like that, who have this really far reach, right? They will come up with some copy that will generally be the narrative, and then that will be spread out to newspapers all across the world who will then cover it. So it gets followed very quickly, but there are homegrown sightings that start pretty quickly thereafter. And so throughout Europe, South America especially, is where you just start to see this stuff pop up. Sightings are made from pilots all over the world. You've got discussions about this stuff going on in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc. So the UFOs don't respect boundaries. Why would they, right? So there's attention paid to it. There are sightings made to it. And that those two things sort of come together. I'm a believer that I think the evidence shows that while the media is going to play a really big role in how you frame all this stuff, I think the evidence is pretty compelling that the sightings themselves are largely grassroots. They are not being orchestrated. They are not being choreographed. They are coming up from people out there who are reporting this stuff. And it's not to say that the media doesn't play a role. I think it does play a role. We might get into that as we move along. But that to me is one of the more interesting aspects of it. And the same thing is going to happen over the course of the 50s as the first UFO groups start to form. Same thing. It's all pretty grassroots, and nobody has any control over it because nobody can. And so there is this kind of infectious quality to it that's really, I think, pretty fascinating when you sort of dig into it and really sort of dive in and look at all the material out there.
So one of the things that we see in the film in Close Encounters is the idea that once these sightings happen almost immediately in the film. And I love that the movie does this, like this slow burn until we finally see, the mothership and stuff like that. But very evidently, we've got the little boy and things and stuff like that. But there's also the aspect here, Greg, where they're having to convince folks that, no, I'm not crazy. I saw this. This is real. We saw this. And of course, there's the very real part between Richard Dreyfuss and his wife, who just doesn't believe. He's having these visions. They're all having. We'll get to the potato scene in a bit, but I'm kind of wondering, as we see, the Associated Press telling these stories, like, hey, there were these sightings and stuff like that. Is there also a skepticism in its own time about the reality of these things? Are people pushing back immediately? Is this being viewed both ways at the time in the 40s and 50s? How were people who did not see these things responding to people who did?
Yeah, right. No, absolutely. I mean, almost immediately there is a response of people saying, hold it, come on, this stuff has pretty simple explanations, or I think people are being hysterical, or I think people are making this stuff up. There's a lot of different sort of responses that are, the typical response of the skeptic. I'd say probably the two groups who express this the most are going to be sort of academics like me, scientists, right? Killjoys, who they don't go out, on the lecture circuit or anything. Most of them don't. What they do is they just get interviewed. The newspapers will ask them for a quote, and they'll explain, oh yeah, I think this is just really, it's really easy. These are balloons, or these are aircraft, or these are cirrus clouds, or something like that. The other, of course, is the military. I mean, in the case of the United States, they set up investigations almost just within weeks and months of this. They start looking into it in the Air Force, and they keep studying it, and they keep arguing, we don't see anything in this stuff that worries us in any way. And they keep sort of beating the drum of, there's nothing here to see. But we're gonna keep tabs on it. But there really is nothing that for us that worries us as a national security threat, and we don't see any evidence to indicate that these are extraterrestrial in origin. So there is a pushback to this stuff that goes on pretty quickly.
Did you encounter any kind of in the archive looking at religion or things like that to see how, the idea that there would be other species in the galaxy, in the universe, confronts the religious storylines of a lot of different religions? Were religious authorities also weighing in on these at the time, did you see, or no?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. They're being asked about it. Especially, in those early, maybe 4 or 5 years where really nobody knew what the heck was going on. Everybody's like, really, everything's up for grabs. And so they do talk to sort of mainstream religious figures and theologians and ask them to weigh in. The Christians are particularly interested in, are the aliens saved? Because if they haven't heard the gospel, if they haven't heard the words of Christ, what happens to them? Are they damned? Do we need to send missionaries out there to bring the word of Christ to them? And the answers that people provide go in different ways. Some argue that maybe, in fact, what they are is they're actually all saved, and that they actually occupy a sort of safe space. They are the saved. Some make the argument that much like children, infants who die before they could be baptized. The church, and Catholic Church especially, says these infants, of course, are saved because they didn't have any opportunity to be able to be baptized, so they are like babes in that sense. They are like babies in that sense, in that of course they're saved because they haven't had the opportunity to hear the word of God. So there are figures who are going to sort of go in that direction. But the people who really glom onto this are going to be people who are very influenced by New Age religion and New Age religious movements, who see in this something quasi-mystical as a way of expanding one's consciousness and connecting with our what's going to be often referred to as our cosmic or space brothers and sisters.
There's an old quote, and I maybe it's Asimov who said this, that any sufficiently advanced technology counts for magic.
Right.
I could see that. What about like these conspiracy theories, the ideas about places like, say, like Area 51 and stuff like that that have continued to become like part of the American dogma? It's shown up. I think one of the films we talked about doing was like Independence Day. Obviously, that thing takes place. It's not too far from where I'm at here in Pueblo. How do we account for places like this and the idea that like how the idea of these sightings is linked to these larger governmental cover-ups and this distrust of the government as time moves on, that, oh, wait, they're definitely there, but it's because the government won't let us know. And we've continued to see this. I think recently there have been more sightings and so forth. And no, the Air Force knows something and stuff like that. How are sightings reflected through the lens of like the way that the United States, or say people in the country, view the government itself?
Yeah, I mean, and that too, that this idea of a government cover-up starts to take shape pretty quickly, and it's definitely sort of crystallizes in 1950 is when I think it really sort of is embedded into the fabric of all this stuff through the works of a pulp fiction writer and former military officer by the name of Donald Kehoe. Becomes the sort of the first great UFO investigator. The conspiracy theory about the government is as it involves UFOs, is, I think, really related to something quite real that's going on in the 1940s, especially, and that is, of course, World War II. You take a look at first of all the size of government in, say, 1950 versus 1850, right? It's a massive difference, a huge bureaucracy with a lot of moving parts, a lot of money, and a lot of wherewithal. Secondly, what you've got is World War II shows everybody, coming out of World War II, everybody becomes fully aware now that governments have secret programs. The Manhattan Project, right? Kept secret, created this unimaginable, quite for most people, unimaginable weapon, right? And the question, of course, is what else are they capable of? And so it's fun. It's not at all strange that there's three countries in say around 1950 who were suspected, and even earlier, suspected of being behind the UFO program, if it exists, if UFOs and flying saucers are homegrown here on Earth. There's three countries that people think they could be. They're either the creation of the United States, the Soviet Union, or they were the creation of Nazi Germany. Three highly industrialized countries with technical and scientific expertise capable of doing it, and all three rather large states and bureaucracies. So all of that stuff about, I think, government conspiracies is really, really hardwired into the UFO phenomenon pretty quickly, because it connects again to that theme we were talking about there before about science and technology.
Well, we see that reflected in the movie, right? And I was a little surprised. coming to this film, I was familiar with the movie. I had seen bits and pieces, and this movie is a little bit like another film, like The Right Stuff. So whenever you say Close Encounters, I think of a couple scenes, right? I think of the potato scene, which we'll talk about in a second, and I think about the music and the end scene where the little gray men show up with the hands and stuff like that. Right Stuff, I remember watching and thinking, oh, okay, I remember the guys walking down, the big scene. I think I remember the poster more than anything else. So then I went back to watch it. I was like, oh, wow, this movie is 17 hours long. So going back to rewatch this film, I was very much those aspects of the government cover-up are very much a real part of this film, right? We see this when they're spraying the stuff to knock. They've got to create the story to get everybody out of Devil's Tower. At the same time, they're having public hearings where these guys are, talking about this kind of what they're seeing, and I found in the film, I don't know, it was like I was actually kind of surprised to see them, the government, at least early on, being as open to the idea of these things. Where the guys in charge are like, well, we really don't even know what's happening, and then later on, like, yeah, okay, we actually do know, and we've got the stuff, and we even have a keyboarder we borrowed from the band Toto or whoever, I don't know, who is going to communicate with these. Were there talks, Greg, that you saw, like, if they're real, how do we talk to these? Like, how does it even make it? We saw this in films like Arrival recently, but did you see anything else like okay, how do we communicate if they are real? How do we even talk to these guys?
That the communication is huge in this movie. It's constantly thinking about communication, trying to figure out the intentions of these things. And you see, Spielberg puts it into all these different scenes. I mean, you've got the problem with communication with Roy and his family and his wife, right? That there's a communication problem there. Actually, one of my favorite scenes. It's an innocuous little thing, I think, for most people, but for me, it's really kind of cool. Is when they bring him in, when Lacombe, right, Francois Truffaut, and Bob Balaban. They bring him into this room to interrogate him or find out what he's going through. And I love it because Dreyfuss is great in that scene. But what you see this confusion, and I just love it when he just really exasperated. He just says, "Who are you guys? Who are you?" It's like this sense of like, who the hell are you? And that's kind of the theme, because it comes up at the end when the question is about what he wants to do with the alien ship showing up. And he's just like, I just need to know. I just need to know. And so there's always this kind of sense of how do we communicate? How do we exchange views on things that's kind of constantly there. And again, that is something that was always has been a big part of the UFO phenomenon historically, is this question of if they're here, why aren't they saying something? Or is it us? Are we doing something wrong? Are we not listening the right way? Or do they want to be silent, right?
Yeah, I say this as my 14-month-old puppy is right next to me, and it's amazing. When you think about it, like, how do you communicate cross species? It's so utterly unintuitive to figure out. Like, so I found the idea that they were communicating really via math with with sound and lights and things like that to me. But there was also this aspect of like being drawn. There was this otherworldly, spiritual kind of thing that Spielberg is playing on too. We see this with some of his later films. Dare I even mention the Indiana Jones and Crystal Skull film? Like they're getting at this other idea. Like you're talking about the spirituality of this. It's like embedded within these communication networks here. I wanted to ask you. You just brought up the scene where they're talking, the interrogation scene. Are there other moments when you're watching this, when you went back to rewatch this, especially after writing this book, that really just hit you? We're calling them our codfish moments now. This goes back to Joanne Freeman on the pod, but like there's a moment, for Joanne when we're watching the Franklin series and they're arguing in treaty rights over codfish in New England. They're like, oh, nobody talks about this, but I know why this is important. Were there moments in this film when you're like, oh my gosh, I got this. I get, like, this is speaking to me specifically when you were watching this movie, like, oh, I get why they're doing this now, especially 46, 47 years after this film comes out now.
Yeah. I think, again, one of the scenes, again, probably people look over. I'd even forgot it was in the movie until I looked at the movie recently again, was early on with the control tower. These guys are looking at radar, right? They're talking to these pilots flying who are seeing something. First of all, the banter, I mean, the conversation is like so good. I mean, wow.
Oh, yeah.
It feels like you're in the room, and it feels very real. And this thing goes, wow, that flew by us real fast. Very close encounter with this thing. And then the guy, the air traffic controller says something like, do you want to report an unidentified flying object? And this pregnant pause. And the guy says, no. How about, airline, la, 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 do you want to do it? No, why would I do that? I love that because it captures this thing that's very, very real, has come up in congressional hearings even recently, right? That pilots have particularly military pilots, but civilian pilots who strongly discouraged through peer pressure, but also pressure from above to not report UFO sightings, because if you're doing that, again, it's like what we talked about before. You're reporting that you saw a spacecraft from outer space. You saw aliens, and nobody wants that on their record. Nobody wants to do it, and so it gets buried. I thought it was a really nice touch, and really brought you right into the middle of all this really quickly.
I loved that for a couple of different reasons. First of all, just like you're saying, it's like, no, like, but also the tension that Spielberg ratchets up through this film. It's really, and you see this later on with some of the stuff that he does, say like with the T-Rex in Jaws, or excuse me, the T-Rex in Jurassic Park and stuff like that, or even like in Jaws, his first film, we don't see the thing early on. It's all about the heightened tension beforehand. But yeah, that scene with you bring that up. I remember writing this down. I was like, oh my gosh, this is good. We don't know what we're going into. They don't want to believe, but they clearly saw something, right?
Yeah.
I want to ask you, actually, speaking of seeing stuff, we were talking a little bit about, are there narratives? We're talking about sightings here, where people are seeing the saucer. There are also narratives about people who say they've been abducted. And I know you're working towards this a little bit now, but are there differences in the narratives themselves when people are talking about? Are there commonalities that you saw when people are saying, "Hey, I saw a thing in the sky, I don't know what it was," versus "I got taken into the ship, I had these experiences"? Are the abduction narratives happening at the same time as these initial UFO sightings, or do they start to occur later? What happens between, say, abduction versus sightings?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that the sightings, the just sightings of something unidentified flying in the air, precede these kind of abduction stories. Some people have looked back and said, "Oh, we can find some traces of early abduction claims that go back into the 50s and all, even the 40s." But if they are very, very rare that you see this. Nothing like the explosion of people making these claims that you're going to see in the 1980s and 1990s. I think you really have to say that sightings, if you look at archival records of particularly government programs, and even not that, just some civilian UFO organizations dating back as far back as they go, the records show. The first thing that'll strike you is that most sightings are really, let's put it bluntly, boring. There's not much to them. Most people's sightings are, I think I was walking the dog. I saw some weird light in the sky, move fast, and I thought, that's weird. And next thing I knew, it was gone. I don't know what it was. It's a lot of people talk about seeing lights. In the mid 70s, a famous French ufologist claimed that he was writing right at this time in 77, I think it was, said that the evidence from French organizations were 70% of sightings were at nighttime. So most people see lights, and they see strange lights that didn't make a lot of sense to them. And so they don't have a lot to say beyond that. Other people will have more, not lucid, but more elaborate stories to tell, because they'll have a longer period of time in which they'll observe something moving around, right? But what you don't tend to have, there's a great sociologist who's written about this in France, a guy by the name of Arnaud Esquer, who's looked at French archival stuff, and he makes the point that I think is pretty compelling, that what you get with people who have a lot more to say is you get a lot more drama. The narratives get more dramatic. There's an arc, there's a plot, right? A beginning, middle, and end, in comparison with your average person who sees something and doesn't have much to add, about it. And so that's what you start to see with people who say they had contact with aliens. They become more elaborate. And then with the alien abduction phenomenon, you add other rather melodramatic elements. None of this is to say, because I'm not in the business of trying to adjudicate all this stuff. None of this is to say that people are making things up. Some, debunkers want to make that argument. But what it means is, and Esquer's point is that what it means is people, as they try to grapple with some sort of understanding of things, they're just turning to things they know, which is how to tell a story. And as you well know, as anybody knows who reads or studies history, this is what we do. We human beings, we're storytellers, we're story makers, we're story listeners. And it's not a surprise that we turn to stories to try to make sense of it all.
I want to ask you about the stories then of the little gray man. We show up at the very end of the film. We finally get to see the people who come out of the ship. And it's very much in line with a lot of these sketches that we've seen, some of the descriptions there. I think the Area 51 stories. So this seems to be another very common stuff. You talked a little bit about the saucer that we see so much in a lot of these sightings. Where does the idea of like this gray man come from? This slender guy with the big bulbous head and the big eyes. Why does this particular version of the extraterrestrial creature? Why is that one so global? It seems like. Where does this guy come from?
And this is one of those other weird things that's in the movie. So I would say this looks a lot like that gray alien that has become sort of so famous, though the gray alien that people are going to associate with UFOs is really something that only takes real firm shape, I think, in the 1990s, in the mid 1990s,
really?
with the Whitley Strieber book Communion. Of course, the movie about that, and you talk about a scary movie, that was a petrifying movie. But
I have not seen this.
Oh, film. You got to see that. Christopher Walken.
Communion?
Christopher Walken is the main character.
Oh, now I'm doing the sound in my head.
Now you gotta see him, and he's great. And there's all sorts of beings in that one. But the book Communion has an image on the cover. I talk about this in my book, that becomes the sort of template for what so many people talk about. But there's like three beings, right? In Close Encounters, there's this first sort of spidery figure, and then there's these little people who you think they're children, but it's hard to believe they'd be kids. It's hard to tell. And we see them only in kind of silhouette. And then this last being who seems a mix of all of these things. And all of these are sort of fit certain molds. The little people are described already in the 1950s. People are talking about little men. When they talk about seeing aliens, they talk about them being little men. They don't say little green men. That I don't know where the little green man comes from, but the little men is the way they're described as. And then some of the elements seem to be borrowed from maybe the famous abduction case of Betty and Barney Hill in the 1960s, and there was later in the early 70s made into a television film. So some of those elements seem to be there, but I'm not sure where he got the idea for some of these things. That spidery figure, for instance, doesn't quite
A little scary.
map on. Very scary, and doesn't really map on. So I don't know where it comes from for Spielberg, but the thing that's interesting is when you look in the 1960s and 70s, and people are talking about alien encounters, the shape, the size, the physiognomy of these things, it's pretty diverse. It's just as diverse as the kind of objects that people describe seeing. So there's kind of over time, as things get more homogeneous in the descriptions, and that's kind of an interesting thing, right?
Well, I have to ask, right? Because this is a film and history podcast. How are films affecting the history here and reflecting this? We're obviously talking about Close Encounters. We've got 45 years of time period between the time this film comes out and the present day, 46 years, 47 years. Now, this is not the only film. You talked a little bit about The Day the Earth Stood Still. There are other films that are reflecting these paranoia, maybe these anxieties. Sometimes they're silly, like Mars Attacks. Independence Day is the exact opposite of this film. Do you think are films shaping the sightings at all?
The evidence is pretty ambiguous at best about that. For instance, we know that in the case of, say, Spielberg's other alien movie, E.T., right, which comes out, what is that, 82? Is it 82?
Feels right, yeah.
Early 80s. It's a blockbuster. It's a blockbuster in the UK, for instance, and immediately after it, sightings go down, not up. It's interesting about this movie, Close Encounters, is it's commonly said, you'll see this said all the time, that sightings went up after Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I actually talked with and asked about this to one of the people who has been and still is the director of the Center for UFO Studies that was founded in the early 70s. And he said he remembers the conversations at the time and what they were seeing in the wake of this. And he said they did not see an uptick in sightings. What they saw was an uptick in people reporting having seen something earlier in their life. So that the film didn't generate more sightings. It generated more people going, I saw things like that back when I was a kid, or 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 25 years ago. That to me is really interesting, right? That it doesn't quite work the way we think it might have worked.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you just mentioned something like, who are ufologists? Does the government have a dedicated branch of study to extraterrestrials? Or is there an authority? We see this in the film, like there are authorities in the Air Force and stuff like that. But do we now have accredited scientific studies to UFOs themselves? Obviously, we have scientists and things like that. But like, where is the study of UFOs coming from? And is it like a real thing?
Well, you've had civilian organizations of people who have done this, and they've been around for, like I say, the early 1950s is when they started to form and take shape. And some of those organizations are still around. Some that had, been around since at least the 1970s are still around. And in many cases, the people involved in them are people with technical training, engineering training, or professionals, scientific professionals of various kinds. You don't have, and you haven't had until very, very, very recently, anything like an academic place a science, a university-based center where these things are taking place, this research. But you, of course, have had government programs, and we have one now, which is the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or ARROW, which has been around for a few years now. And ARROW is under the Department of Defense. It is keeps track of this stuff, looks into cases. It's been sort of spending a lot of time looking at a lot of reports, particularly from military pilots, but they're now starting to dig into some of the civilian reports over, I don't know, I guess the past 10, 15, even 20 years, to try to understand what's being reported out there. So they're looking into it. And what's also going on right now is interest in a lot of academics. I know a lot of these people who are involved in this. And so people who actually have professional associations at universities, scientific researchers who are say it's time for us to dive into this. And that has been legitimated through a panel, an ad hoc panel formed by NASA a few years ago, who came out and said, yeah, we should encourage people to study this stuff in a serious fashion, in a scientifically rigorous way, right? And so people are starting to do that.
All right. Well, I have to ask you that because so much of this, I want to get into the history of the history here, because this is not your first book. How do you even begin to study this? Like, what are the questions? Like, where are the archives for this, Greg? You're in Pennsylvania most of the time. How do you, as a scholar, begin to conceptualize this? Do you remember the moment when you were like, I have an idea. I'll think about a book about this. Like, when was the germinating moment? When was your Devil's Tower for this book, Greg?
Right. Yeah. Well, my Devil's Tower moment was after I had this, I said, this kind of crazy interest in looking into this. And I actually sat and looked at some newspapers in Germany, from Germany, and wrote a small article about the initial interest in Germany in the 40s and 50s in flying saucer reports. Because I was just curious about it. And it's real easy for me to do. I had access to some digital newspapers and sort of tracked that and thought that was kind of interesting. And then as I said before, when I thought, wow, people in my field, my union of historians, we're not doing this stuff. Why don't I dive into this? So I was like, okay. And you're right. The first thing you ask yourself is, okay, where do I find the sources? There are government records, but that carries you only so far. And I was kind of interested in all the movers and the shakers involved. And that was more than the government for sure. And so I knew there were magazines and publications, but where were they? These are things that people, I assume, threw out. So I started looking around. Is anybody collecting this stuff? And some people were collecting it. So what I realized really quickly was I needed to get to know people who do ufology. People also around, particularly the veterans, the people who've been around for a while, right? The people who've made it their lives, dedicated their lives to studying this. And the thing that I found out that I wasn't aware of was that ufologists are by their very nature archivists. They collect stuff and they never throw anything out. They never throw anything out because it's going to be useful. Right. And so they collect, and so many have these collections, newspaper clipping files. They have documents, they have newsletters, they have their correspondence saved. And I found out in particular then when I was in Europe that in Sweden, in a place called Norrköping, a Swedish UFO organization has made it their business for years, very quietly, collecting stuff from all over the world. And they're not the only ones. There are places in the States that are doing this as well. But theirs is the biggest, as far as I can tell, the biggest collection in the world. And I wrote them and said, I'd like to come look at this stuff. They said, sure. I went over there, flew over to Stockholm one summer, and they were I owe them so much because they just welcomed me with open arms, and they said, look at whatever you want, take pictures of whatever you want. And I would just spend an entire day. They literally gave me the key to the place. I've never had that
Oh my
experience.
gosh.
They literally just said, here's the key, open up whenever you get here in the morning, close up if you're staying later than us. And it's a stunning amount. I could not cover all of it. A lot of it is language barriers. But people out there want to go do this. There's a lot to be done about places like India, Southeast Asia, Japan. There's a lot of material.
I had to ask, so first of all, congratulations on finding an archive to get to go to in Sweden. I'm sure everyone listening right now feels terrible for you that you go to.
That was cool.
Oh man. Yeah. I wonder, you already had tenure at this point in time, I'm assuming whenever was there any pushback or anything like that when you were like, hey, I want to write this book at this point? Do you think there would have been a difference as far as say like trying to write this book pre-tenure or something like that versus or post-tenure? I'm wondering, was there skepticism, Greg, on the part of like, we talk about skepticism about sightings. Was there skepticism about writing about this as a real historical event? You went through Oxford University Press, and I want to talk about that in a second, but like, did you have any pushback initially? Like, I don't know about that.
I never got the kind of pushback I might have expected. You're quite right. Doing this after having tenure, having, books behind me and a track record of being a serious researcher, I think helped a lot with that. There's no question I had some colleagues raising eyebrows, lots of little jokes that are made. Some colleagues who I think may well have were wondering about me, because the assumption is always you got an investment here, I guess. You've got an agenda. I did apply for twice for a National Science Foundation grant and was rejected. Not unusual, by the way. You get lots of people get rejected for those.
It's part of the story.
But some of the reasoning that I got in the arguments that readers were making, I thought were exactly that. Why is it necessary to study a pseudoscience? Why is it interesting or important to study stuff that is really worthless? And I think that raises the hairs on the back of our necks, or raises our cackles as historians. It's like, oh, right, okay. So I saw a little of that. But remember, I'm also somebody who was very fortunate to get funding for all this stuff. I got funding from the American Philosophical Society, from my university, from the Smithsonian and National Air and Space Museum, from NASA, the American Historical Society. I don't say that to brag. I say that to say that tells me that institutions felt like this is the time to do this, right? So I will say this, though. While I think I would have been very hesitant to take this on earlier on for two reasons. One is earlier on in my career, I think maybe I might have been worried that maybe people wouldn't take me seriously. But I'd say the biggest thing was because this is easily the biggest challenge I've ever had as a historian, working my way through this material. It's so difficult because there's so much hype and rumor and innuendo and falsehoods and trying to find, the original, right, reports of something rather than the second and third hand. Really, really tough. Lots of little landmines, if you will, around and things to steer around. It was really, really hard. And then to try to do it in a way that respected people's experiences and viewpoints and not disparage people, but also to be critical, right? Really hard to do. And I hope I achieved it. I know there are people who are going to disagree that I did that well.
They're wrong.
But you try to do your best. And so that was really, really hard. So I'd say I could not have written this, say, 10 or 15 years ago. I don't think I could have done this because I wouldn't have had the intellectual maturity, I feel,
The chops.
to have done it. Nah, I couldn't have done it.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to tell you a thing that's going to sound antithetical to what you're saying, because it feels like such an effortless book. And I mean that by, as I'm reading the book itself, it just flows so well. And it felt like almost, as I'm reading through it, Greg, I almost like had a soundtrack in the back of my head. It felt at times like a bit of a detective story. And it just got such a cool flow. You're talking about how difficult it is for you. I guess it both is and is not reflected because it reads so easily. And I mean in the highest
that's
form.
Great. That's very nice to hear. Thanks.
Oh, I love the book. Why Oxford University Press, if I could ask you? Like you went through OUP. It's one of my favorite presses. Why these guys, say, versus somebody else? Did you have a previous relationship with Oxford? Were they gung ho? Why OUP?
Because they came to me.
For real?
They came to me. My editor, Susan Ferber, approached me and asked me if I had heard about what I was working on. And I didn't have a publisher for probably about 75% of the time I was working on the book. When I originally did it, I actually had gotten in touch with an agent, and the agent had tried to sell the project to some of the major trade presses. This is before the 2017 revelations in the New York Times about a secret UFO program in the United States. And he said, he kept getting responses. Wow, sounds interesting. I don't know how to sell this. I don't feel I can sell a book about UFOs. So I got dinged, and then the agent left me. So I went back to the drawing board. I was like, well, I'm just going to keep working and assume that somebody's going to want this eventually. And then approached me, and I gave Susan a sample chapter, which she read very quickly, I think, because I think I heard from her that night. She's like, this sounds fabulous. I love this. Let's if you're interested. And I'm like, yeah. And so it was a really good experience for me because this is the trade branch of OUP. So I get the best of both worlds. Lots of fabulous editing and painstaking work that the production people all put into this that you don't normally see as an academic. But you also get the academic side, which is, peer reviewed and people wanting to make sure all the boxes are ticked in the proper way. So that, to me, I always said this is what I wanted to do with this project. I wanted to write it for a lot of people who were interested in the topic, not to be a kind of a typical academic book, but I wanted it to have academic integrity. And that's the key. I wanted it to be accessible, but I wanted it to have that kind of scholarly integrity. And so Oxford was perfect, has turned out to be, for me, to be a perfect place to do that.
They're sending me a lot of stuff right now for the pod, and I've been really impressed with what they're doing. And your book was like I said, it felt like a trade book, and I mean, and again, when I say I'll read something that feels like a trade book, I say this in the best possible way. I think this is where we need to be, because if we continue to write to the same 75 people that we know in our field, nothing changes, Greg.
Right.
Whether we're talking about this study or native history or any other things, that we do. What blows my mind is that this is the first look at this. You said since 75. So what are the books that or the works that kind of helped shape this scholarship? Were there other writers? I mean, are you having to draw from outside of this to write this book? How does this happen?
Yeah, you kind of do. I mean,
what are your influences?
I will say, when I started to do this stuff, I found that a lot of people in the academic world had been writing about the UFO phenomenon for years. But they weren't historians. They were coming out of religious studies. They were people who were doing literary studies, psychology, sociology, anthropology. The people who actually I found the most informative and for me really helpful, very much to my surprise, were folklorists, people who do folklore studies. They did some really fabulous stuff. And on that count, one book that I think is very much informed by kind of folklore studies is this book called UFO Crash at Roswell by Benson Saylor, Charles Ziegler, and Charles Moore. And that's a really neat, very slender book written in the mid 90s. That's about how the different versions about the Roswell crash emerged and sort of built on one another. That was really kind of cool. I also went way back, relatively way back, and was like a lot of people who were interested in the social sort of cultural phenomenon of UFOs. I was really influenced by the last book that the famous Swiss psychologist Carl Jung wrote. Carl Jung was fascinated with flying saucers and was collecting on them, almost collecting newspaper articles on the subject for right off the bat. And he ends up writing a book in 1958 called Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the sky. And it still holds up. It's still a fascinating psychological understanding of all this stuff as it's going on, right? As he starts to try to figure out how does it make sense. And he even interprets, he has some patients who have UFO dreams that he starts to analyze in it. And then later on, I when it came to the whole alien abduction phenomenon, I was really, really impressed by this book written in the actually it was like, I guess it was around 2006, 2007, written by Bridget Brown, who I guess is an American Studies scholar, and wrote this book called something like They Know Us Better Than We Know Ourselves, in which she details and describes spending time with an alien abduction support group and sort of analyzes what's going on. And she was really, really helpful. That book was really informative for me in terms of thinking about how do I make sense of this utterly remarkable set of experiences and stories that people are telling, and why are they sort of taking shape the way they are as people sort of come to these narratives over time. That too was absolutely helpful and fascinating for me. Yeah.
We talked about this particular movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Are you a movie buff? Do you like other movies about this kind of stuff? You know, are there other films that you watched while you were prepping this work up?
Oh, I'm a huge horror movie fan. I mean, that is my wife and I. That is our go-to. We watch. Well, even last night, what did we watch? We just watched Ghost Station. That was it. Ghost Station. I think a Korean film that is okay. Wasn't my favorite, but anyway, love horror, supernatural, terrifying things. That includes science fiction. You know, when it hits that sweet spot that we're talking about here. There was a recent film that was streaming on one of the services called, I believe, No One Will Save You, that involves alien abduction. That was, I thought, utterly terrifying. Absolutely, I thought fabulous. And I won't ruin it for you or anybody else listening, because there's something about it that is really, really unusual, and you don't even notice it until probably midway in the film. And then my jaw just dropped, and I thought, oh my God, that's what this film is doing, something I haven't seen in a maybe ever in a film. It's really unusual, but I won't say what that is.
Is it streaming now?
It is streaming. I think it's No One Will Save You.
So we've got a couple HATM mainstays. Rachel Gunter is one of them. She's a phenomenal scholar out of Texas, and she's the biggest horror fan. So you start talking about horror, I'm like, I'm going to hear about this from Rachel. She's like, we don't do enough scary movies on HATM on Sunday nights.
Movies, yeah.
Yeah, well, we've got Godzilla -1
Oh,
coming
good.
up on
I
this
haven't
coming
seen it
Sunday,
yet.
which
I'm
isn't
saving it. Saving it for
great.
a big screen. I don't want to watch it on my laptop. I need it on a bigger screen.
It's phenomenal.
Oh,
Like I said,
cool.
I watched Oppenheimer last year, and I thought Oppenheimer was amazing. I thought Godzilla. It's the movie that has stayed with
Oh,
me
I'm so excited.
in ways
Cool.
I won't reveal anything. There's a big lizard. Um, I found it to be absolutely amazing, kind of thing. Circling back to this particular film, I guess the big question we've got here when we come back to this is Close Encounters of the Third Kind a history movie?
What does that mean? What do you mean when you say that?
That's up to you, man. Like that's the thing I'm gonna ask everybody to find on their own. We're historians of the movies. Is this a history movie, Greg? Do we look at this film and think, how do we think about Close Encounters 47 years later?
Yeah.
How do we think about this movie?
I don't think it's the way I typically define a history movie is it's trying to be a period piece, I guess you'd say, right? And so it's trying to capture a historical moment. I don't think I get a sense that Spielberg was trying to do that, though he did. He was capturing that moment. So in that sense, it's a history movie because I think what it does is it so nicely encapsulates so many of the benchmarks of where particularly America was, but not just America, but primarily America was in its engagement with the whole UFO phenomenon in 1977. It does it in a way that no other film does really well. I mean, we talked about some of these other films, E.T., Fire in the Sky. You could talk about these things, and they do some of that. But I think no film does it in the same way that he does, in terms of really giving you this sense of place and space and time, where you feel like, yeah, this resonates with the kinds of things I was encountering as I was sort of working through all that material for my book.
I have one other final question for you. You talk in the book about not wanting to weigh in on whether or not you think extraterrestrials exist or anything like that. I'm not going to ask you that. I want to ask you if you want there to be extraterrestrials.
That's a good question. I don't think anybody's asked me that before. I hear a lot of people. I'm going to probably give you a very unsatisfactory answer, by the way, so I'll probably
give it to me.
But I've heard from a lot of people who have said to me personally, but also sometimes people made this point of writing, that they don't want to live in a world, in a universe that we're the only ones. It would seem a very, very lonely place, right? The kind of Fox Mulder poster of the X-Files, I want to believe.
I want to believe.
I don't personally have a desire to want to believe. I don't need to believe. So I don't feel this compulsion to not be alone in the universe. It feels lonely as it is. So if they're not visiting us and they're out there, we're still feeling pretty lonely out there. So I don't necessarily feel that compulsion. At the same time, it'd be pretty cool if we were to find out we're not alone. Little spooked by the possibility because of the history of humanity, right? The history of societies and cultures engaging with one another who have different technological capacities. As you well know, those encounters have not been particularly peaceful. They have not been particularly good for the people who don't have those capacities, or don't have the same kind of capacities technologically. And so that worries me. But it would also be a pretty neat thing that would open up lots of new questions, and that would be kind of fun. And I think we'd have a lot of fun contemplating what the next steps would be, right? As a society, that would be well worth spending some time on.
Well, you're not going to be alone this fall. I'm assuming you're going to go back to Pennsylvania, correct? Are you teaching this fall?
I am going to actually go back. I'm going to spend the fall in Princeton. I've got a small. I'm going to be at the Davis Center to work on my alien abduction project and to sort of present some of my earliest findings to the Davis Center there. So I'm looking forward to like being pushed by all the great historians there and by all the other fellows who are going to be there, and start racking my brain more seriously about this next project.
Man, I am so excited to hear about it. Greg, I am so thankful to you. I've loved talking to you today, like be able to set this up and stuff like that. I'll tell you, sometimes I have timidity. Like, is this person gonna be cool? I'm gonna like talking to the person. And I've had a blast, dude, talking to you. I've had a blast reading your book. Thank you so very much. I know you're far away over in Germany for taking the time to do this today, man. I really thank you so much for being here. This was awesome.
This was a blast. Thanks very much, Jason.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so very much to our new friend, Greg Eghigian, for taking the time to Skype in with us, Riverside in with us, whatever. Talk to us from Germany today and talk to us about his amazing book, After the Flying Saucers Came, A Global History of the UFO Phenomenon. Thank you, of course, to our partner in crime, our producer, Fletcher Powell, who is not in outer space, but is in Kansas, its own extragalactic place. Fletcher, thank you so much for being here. And guys, thank you so much for being part of the HATM community. Thank you for continuing to like, share, subscribe, all of this with your friends, family, neighbors, and enemies. So if you like this pod, please keep sharing it. Guys, this was amazing. Ciao for now.